The ZF's retro charm versus the Z6 III's modern wizardry, but instead of one I actually need both. I don't just shoot street and travel, I also run 2 YouTube channels, and for me a 2-camera workflow is essential. I've shot with the Z6 III for a month, the ZF for 6 months, street and travel both day and night, and rather than let their different ergonomics and feature sets get in the way, I use 3 accessories and 6 settings to make them the perfect pairing. But which is the A cam and which is the B cam? If I can only choose one? In the end it comes down to head versus heart, Steve McCurry, and the last roll of Kodachrome. Thank you to Wortencraft for providing the straps and Cantina bag for my new 2-camera setup. And as always, I have final edit. Hello, I'm Jack, scientist, street photographer, and this is Bokeh Therapy. Is the Z6 III's partially stacked sensor worth it for street photography? No street shooter I know needs 120 frames per second, but the faster sensor means the Z6 III's quieter and faster in every setting. Its electronic shutter is usable under almost every situation. Straight lines don't warp when panning, it's completely silent, letting me get close without bruising the scene. There is one situation when it doesn't work so well: nighttime indoor shooting. Older LED lamps turn on and flicker at different rates at night, and that's when banding appears on the Z6 III. Its sensor is still slower than the Z8 and Z9. There's still a mechanical shutter in this camera. Setting 6 is how I set this up differently in the Z6 III versus ZF. On the Z6 III, I map function 1 to turn on silent mode, the quickest one button way to turn on electronic shutter, and this button is missing on the ZF. The ZF does have a front function button, but the position matches function 2 on the Z6 III, so I mapped that button to playback for both cameras. Lets me review images through the EVF without taking my hands off the grip. The mechanical shutter on the Z6 III is quieter than the ZF, but the Z6 III does make an extra click on startup compared to the ZF. So that sound on the Z6 III is the IBIS mech being activated on startup. In terms of startup time, the ZF is fast, but the Z6 III starts up twice as fast. I originally thought the Z6 III's partially stacked sensor is only useful for video, but all these features are clear advantages over the ZF for street photography. The ZF sensor came from the original Z6, so is the tech inside finally out of date? A 2009 announcement sent photographers scrambling to their fridges. Other than check the use-by date of their own rolls of Kodachrome, there was nothing they could do when Kodak stopped its production. Unless of course your name is Steve McCurry. Kodak sent McCurry the last roll ever produced, but even for someone with his stature, this was a heavy burden to shoulder. For this project, he would need more than a romance of the last roll of Kodachrome in his Nikon F6. He needed a second camera, a digital camera, a Nikon D3X to preview every scene. On this project, he couldn't afford to take the chance of a messed up exposure head over heart. The ZF weighs 710 grams versus the Z6 III's heavier 760 grams, but you lose the ZF's weight advantage if you add any sort of hand grip. The ZF is colder to the touch. The top metal plates feel old school and premium, whereas the leatherette covering of the Z6 III is softer. Both the newer and Nikon's own ZF GR1 grip add a back grip bump to the ZF, but this is built into the Z6 III by default. The ZF is also wider by about 1 centimeter. Even though the Z6 III is deeper and denser because of its much bigger grip, it still takes up less space in a camera bag, like Wortencraft's Cantina series. It comes with 3.5 or 2 liter, but for full frame cameras I use a 3.5 liter. There's bottom padding, camera dividers, and a drawstring lining for when it rains, dump pockets at the front, zipper pockets at the back, sunglasses, Osmo Pocket 3, field notes, pen and wallet all fit. Cantina bag together with the crossbody and wrist straps make for a quick and easy 2-camera setup. The Z6 III has a joystick, the ZF doesn't, but I use 3D tracking so I don't need a joystick. The ZF encourages me to interact more with the camera to tweak its settings, whereas the Z6 III's controls want you to set it and forget it. Carrying 2 cameras on the street is surprisingly fussy. Holster straps like Holdfast and Clever Supply Co. just look too aggressive for everyday shooting. Like McCurry, I tried a 2-neck strap setup, but the cameras kept bumping against each other, so what I landed on in the end was a crossbody and wrist strap combo. I put the ZF on a shoulder strap, the Z6 III on a wrist strap. When I need to shoot with with the ZF, I swing it around my shoulder and let the wrist strap and Z6 III dangle. And setting 5 that I use across both these cameras is to limit the exposure triangle to 2 dials. On the ZF, my ISO dial is set to C, auto ISO on for both aperture priority and manual. My shutter speed dial is set to 1/3 step, which shifts control to the rear command dial. The front dial is for aperture, and now I'm just manipulating the 2 command dials like on the Z6 III. I set the exposure compensation dial to C, map the record button to press plus command dial and exposure compensation, which most closely matches the position and setup of exposure comp on the Z6 III as well. Speaking of exposure, this brings us to the elephant in the room, dynamic range. By now we all know that from ISO 100 to 800, the Z6 III loses half to a full stop of dynamic range compared to the ZF, which affects highlight and shadow recovery in theory. But did this affect my workflow in practice? Hitting the pavement in his hometown, New York City, Steve McCurry already knew all the best locations: Chinatown, Brooklyn Bridge, the majesty of Times Square, but in this moment he felt reluctant to press the shutter. What image could possibly be worthy of this final roll of Kodachrome? He finished that day empty-handed, because even legendary photographers in amazing locations can let their heads get the better of their hearts. In that moment he had lost his creative spark. Setting 4 that I keep the same in both the ZF and Z6 III is leaving auto ISO on, and how Nikon handles auto ISO is what confuses new shooters to the system the most. When the ISO dial is set to C, it just matches whatever you set in the ISO sensitivity menu. For me, it's minimum 100, maximum 32,000. It's great low light performance for both cameras. If the ISO dial points to anything else, it overrides these settings and acts as a range limiter to redefine the new minimum ISO. If the dial is pointing, say, to 1600, your new ISO range moves from 100 to 1600 up to 32,000. Most cameras let you save up to 3 different auto ISO settings, but technically Nikon lets you have a different auto ISO setting for every click on the ISO dial. But I don't really use it. On my ZF, the ISO dial stays on C. It's because this way it functions exactly the same as my Z6 III, and I shoot both cameras in tandem. I find both cameras are really great at managing the exposure triangle by themselves, keeps the ISO as low as I like it to be. Shooting backlit against the Australian sun at noon is the most high dynamic range setting I ever shoot in at base ISO, and honestly I couldn't tell the difference between these 2 cameras. Using auto ISO, aperture priority, I set exposure comp down to -0.3 or -0.7 to protect my highlights, and in that setting the images look the same. You'll see from these shots, the shadows are completely black, but I can pull it all back without much noise. If I deliberately overexpose by 3 stops while shooting in matrix metering mode, that highlight detail is gone, but it's gone in the ZF and the Z6 III to a pretty similar extent. Saying the image quality of the Z6 III is a little worse than the ZF is actually not that big an insult because of how good the ZF image quality already is. But your mileage may vary based on how you like to expose. If it's more than 2 stops, you might want to expose your bracket. It doesn't matter what camera you use. And this isn't a torture test I normally put my cameras through anyway. I'm kind of stunned with the performance. It doesn't get more low light than this. According to the test charts, the dynamic range difference between the ZF and Z6 III is gone past ISO 800, and I'm routinely shooting at ISO 25,000 at night. Losing half a stop of dynamic range at ISO 100 just doesn't impact my use case at night, but if high ISO noise is worse than the Z6 III, I may have a problem. Both these images were shot at ISO 25,600, and while there's a lot of noise, the well-exposed parts of the leaves here are still very usable for both shots. To me, in real-world nighttime shooting, there's a very minimal difference between these 2 cameras' high ISO noise. I trust other people's testing under more controlled conditions, but if I can get a usable image at ISO 25,000, 32,000, should we really be complaining? Setting 3 that I use to customize both cameras for shooting is I turn high FPS viewfinder display to on, which is not an option in the ZF. In the setup menu, I turn both viewfinders brightness to +5. This is the max brightness on the ZF, but just about halfway on the Z6 III. The clearer image preview in the field through the EVF makes the Z6 III the easier to use low light camera. So look, to me, it's a tie, but I think the next test will break it. To recapture his mojo, Steve McCurry pulled out all the stops. Intimate close-up shots of Robert De Niro, Bollywood celebrities, elders and children in the slums of Mumbai. McCurry's signature compressed telephoto look was a match made in heaven with the Kodachrome colors, and replaying his hits makes perfect sense when you need to deliver on a project. But when this intercontinental portrait extravaganza was all said and done, the role still wasn't finished. What McCurry chose to shoot with these last 10 frames revealed the most about him. Setting 2 that I share across both these cameras is autofocus, or on the photo shooting menu, single frame release mode, AFC continuous. For AF area mode, I use 3D tracking, just half press the shutter, but Nikon cameras have one more trick up their sleeves. I set the AF on button to AF area mode plus AF on. This lets you have 2 different autofocusing modes on 2 different buttons. I have 3D tracking on the shutter and wide area AFL on the back button. Wide area AF is now looking within a bigger box for subjects to track than 3D tracking. It's a good backup option when the camera loses a spot in the bushes in the middle of the night. I was trying to 3D track a tree, not a face, dog or plane, and the ZF does lose this tree every now and then shooting on a 35mm f1.8 lens, whereas the Z6 III keeps the tree in focus more often shooting on an 85mm lens. This is ISO 51200, h.265 and log. Let me know if you see any flickering in the shadows, but I couldn't notice it. In slightly brighter conditions shooting across a highway, tilting up and down between the fence and the lights, the ZF is a little less decisive, the focus transition more jumpy, whereas the Z6 III doing the same maneuver looks smoother. But for most genres of photography, this difference won't be dramatic. AF isn't the tiebreaker either. The final few frames McCurry shot with the last roll of Kodachrome were remarkable in that they're unremarkable. They're beautifully composed, a harmony of light and texture, but there's no hint of celebrity, no allure of the exotic. That pressure in his head to reach new creative heights had gone, and what was left was all heart, the same curiosity that led us all to photography in the first place. Either everything's worth photographing or nothing's worth photographing. What matters most? Capturing the simple moments. Simplicity is why I landed back on the Nikon ZF. The Z6 III is faster, better ergonomics, with negligible trade-offs in my testing for image quality. I'm lucky enough to have both, but if I can only choose one, it would be the ZF. It feels distinct, the vestige of a bygone era, a simple, friendly camera that prompts conversations with everyone around me. Either everything's worth photographing or nothing's worth photographing, and the ZF will be the camera I use to capture everything around me. When it comes to head versus heart, I follow the emotion, but I do get to shoot it alongside the Z6 III because at the last setting it shares with the Z6 III, manual focus subject detection. This feature works the same in both cameras, the best in the industry I think for shooting vintage manual lenses. Thank you to Bailey NT86 and Gary Booth 2902 for this suggestion, but really it deserves a dedicated video all to itself. How I shoot with manual focus lenses will be in the next video here when it's ready to go. I'm Jack, capturing the peace in every moment.